When I was in high school, I took all the art classes I could, and I dabbled in the various art mediums. I learned to draw with charcoal. I learned to paint with oil. I even made a bust of myself out of clay. When I applied to college, I prepared an art portfolio and I submitted it to the art departments of each college I applied to, figuring that I would be an artist when I grew up. What I quickly learned, though, was that I was not as talented of an artist as I had assumed. My art, which stood out in my hometown in Kansas, was just average in the larger metropolises where I applied to go to college. So I didn't get an art scholarship, and after all that, my career plans shifted pretty dramatically. With that disappointment, I began to dig deeper into my own sense of calling. By my sophomore year, I would often say, I kind of want to be a teacher or a preacher of some sort. Eventually, I leaned into a vocation centered on serving the church. First as a worship pastor, then as a revitalization pastor, then a lead pastor, and now as a university chaplain, working here with the church in the chapel at Northwestern. Looking back over the last 25 years of serving the church, I've seen what seems like an immense amount of change. When I began, the churches that I served were just beginning to incorporate contemporary music and new technology in their Sunday services. When I started, I taught rock bands how to lead corporate worship. I started drama troupes, and I installed sound and lighting system into the sanctuaries. Around 10 years into my career, the focus of many churches shifted. The cutting edge seemed to be in neighborhood engagement, service learning, and community development. In response, I, like many Christian leaders, retooled and learned new skills. We opened the church basement to the local Alcoholic Anonymous chapter. We took senior adults to serve at the local gospel mission and area food distribution centers. We started a soup kitchen for our neighborhood homeless population. Fast forward another 10 years to today, and the landscape of Christian ministry continues to evolve. In fact, at least from my perspective, I would say that the future of the church, at least the church as we know it, seems to be as questionable as ever. In fact, according to David Kinnaman, president of the prominent Christian research organization Barna Group, as many as 1 in 5 churches could permanently close as a result of the shutdowns stemming from the coronavirus pandemic. With all of these unknowns, how are the faithful to respond? I think an appropriate response is called for in today's gospel text, as Jesus invites his followers to be aware, to keep awake, to stay alert. One place to begin paying attention is looking at history to gain a broader perspective. While these recent changes within the church may have felt like a big deal, especially to those involved in local congregations, when we view these changes in the perspective of thousands of years of church history, they become more like returning to a proven technique which has served the church well in the past. You see, incorporating contemporary music has always been a part of the church, long before the days of men like Martin Luther, who during the Reformation took a tavern tune that he knew and turned it into the classic hymn that we know, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Or serving in the neighborhood, that's always been a hallmark of the church's renewal efforts, an essential part of the church since its inception. So, in reality, these movements are really nothing new when evaluated against the big picture of 2,000 years of church history. Yet, many futurologists see the shift taking place in the church today as more substantial than just changes in ministry techniques. Take, for example, the thought of the late Phyllis Tickle, author and religious professor, who in her book, The Great Emergence, used the analogy of the 500-year rummage sale to describe the changes happening within the church. Tickle said that historically, the church cleans house roughly every 500 years, holding what she calls a giant rummage sale, deciding what to dispose of, what to keep, all in the effort of making room for new things. Looking back over 2,000 years, the time of Christ was the first rummage sale, an era that Tickle calls the Great Transformation, when a man from Galilee, who was Emmanuel, God with us, created a new understanding of our relationship with God. 500 years later saw the collapse of the Roman Empire and the beginning of a period known as the Dark Ages. In this period, the church entered an era of preservation, going underground with monks and nuns practicing the monastic tradition in abbeys and convents. Next, at the beginning of the new millennium, in 1054, came the Great Schism, when the Christian church split into two, Eastern and Western branches, churches we know today as the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. Then, in the 1500s, the Reformation resulted in new branches of the Christian tradition, with different understandings of how people relate to God, how to personally connect with God in prayer, and how to interpret the Bible. Every 500 years or so, Tickle says that there are tectonic shifts in the Christian tradition, resulting in huge changes of both understanding and practice. So, it's been 500 years since the Reformation. Is the church ready for its next giant rummage sale? Or perhaps we're already holding it. Another one of these places to pay attention to the immense challenges within the church are within the professional class of people that we know collectively as the clergy. As I look back at the faces of men and women who accompanied me through my first seminary journey some 10 years ago, only about half of them are currently employed by a church. While I imagine most of the seminary community entered seminary with the goal of serving as a traditional pastor, the opportunities for that kind of ministry experience have been few and far between. Instead of serving at a pastor in a local church, many of my seminary colleagues are now working in adjacent fields like education, social work, politics, and institutional chaplaincy. With these challenges has come a large amount of concern and despair, especially within the clergy. As one of my professors within my doctoral program recently wrote, a man named Alan Roxbury, he wrote this. He said, "The grief and the trauma being experienced by many clergy right now is about the realization that we are coming to the end of a way of life of being leaders among God's people. The notion of a vocation built around an individual called to professional ministry, characterized by being a plant manager of a religious organization, cannot address the challenges of our moment. This vocation has run its course in our current context of disintegration." Even so, I am one who believes that God is up to something good in the midst of this unraveling. An alternative imagery to that of a rummage sale emerged in my mind as I read our lectionary text from the prophet Isaiah. It says this, "Yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand." Well, what we have experienced in our lifetime as the church has looked like a tall, delicate vase, nearly ready to be released from the potter's wheel, to be dried, to be fired. It's now being reworked once again into something new. I see that what the church is experiencing this time as an initiative of the master potter who is still reworking pliable clay. While we as clay could resist the potter's effort to bring us back down to size, we could also adopt an alternative posture of trust. We can trust in the Creator's artistic skill and grand design, believing that our God, the master artist, is purposefully and lovingly reworking the clay that we know as the church. So, what is the church going to be when it grows up? Well, if I've learned anything from my 25 years of ministry experience, it's going to be quite different than what we've imagined. The good news is that there are alternative ways of imagining the church sprinkled throughout our history and emerging all around us. The reimagining process begins by first understanding our history and then looking closely at our context, at the current surroundings, specifically the people and the place that God has put us. For I believe it is right here among these people, in this place, that God is reshaping us and making us into whatever He wants us to be for our next work. Our job as followers of Jesus is to stay alert, to continue to encourage one another, and to discern hope in the midst of this current unraveling.